Hi there, welcome to the second part of my video going through how to answer voluntary manslaughter scenario questions. If the scenario involves diminished responsibility, then please make sure you've also watched part 1 where I've gone through how to apply that. So just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, we're looking at how to answer a voluntary manslaughter scenario, which would be worth 25 marks and take typically 30 minutes. And the assessment objectives that we're trying to hit are AO1, which is worth 10 marks for displaying your knowledge and understanding of the topic. And AO2 is out of 15, which is your application of your knowledge to a given scenario. So remember, check the scenario really carefully. Check the command line really carefully. What is the question actually requiring you to do? Is the question just on murder? Is it on murder and loss of control? Or is it just a pure voluntary manslaughter question where you need to consider both diminished responsibility and loss of control? Once you've gone through the scenario, you've perhaps highlighted some key information which suggests a person may have been reacting to something the victim said or did. Then we need to be looking at the law of loss of control. So really important here is to start with a definition of voluntary manslaughter overall if you're starting with loss of control. So voluntary manslaughter is where the defendant has committed the actus reus and mens rea of murder. So they've caused the unlawful killing of a human being under the Queen's peace, but they've done that with malice aforethought because of something someone else has done. That can result in a sentence of up to discretionary life. So that's the maximum. The judges can give lower, but remember that's the key difference from murder and why people will want to be reducing their murder charge. If you're found guilty of murder, the judge has no choice. They have to give you a life sentence. However, if you are found guilty of voluntary manslaughter through loss of control, then the judge has far more options available. They can give you life or they can give you anything else below that. So what do we have to look at? Loss of control was radically changed from provocation in the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. So the defence of provocation is no more. You must be talking about loss of control. And what that means is, essentially, the Coroners and Justice Act overruled the provocation defence, and any cases from before 2009 are outdated. You should not be referring to cases before 2009 because they will not be credited for loss of control. That's different to diminished responsibility. The diminished responsibility defence was just tweaked by the Coroners and Justice Act, and therefore old laws still apply like burn. However, loss of control, make sure everything you refer to in a scenario question is from 2009 onwards. So what does the law say now? The law was tightened up to try and restrict the circumstances where the loss of control defence could be used, particularly in cases of domestic abuse. So there are some quite strict rules that you need to explain and then apply to the scenario. As you can see here, I've colour coded the assessment objectives. So green is AO1 and pink is AO2. And what I'm suggesting here is that you blend the assessment objectives as you're writing. Now that's a more advanced skill, but at the same time it means that you can explain something and then apply it very quickly before you forget to go back through that point. It also means that you're less likely to confuse it with diminished responsibility because there are some elements that are similar, so you have to apply them separately and distinctly. So first, of course, is for the defence of loss of control. Unsurprisingly, you have to talk about the fact that the defendant has lost their self-control. So the way that you blend the assessment objectives and still get the marks for each distinctly is to make sure you're almost writing in two separate sentences. So the first is very objective, neutral language that makes no reference to the scenario whatsoever and the people involved. So the defendant must have lost their self-control, and this was shown in the case of R versus Jewell, where he failed to use the defence because there was clear evidence of planning and premeditation. So what we need to now do is switch to our AO2. We need to look for evidence in the scenario, or not, that they lost their self-control. So is there reference to the person just snapping, losing red? They lost their powers of reasoning. They couldn't be talked to. Someone tried to hold them back. But people talk about red mist descending. That's what we're looking for. Remember from the case of R versus Jewel, if there's any hints of planning this, that suggests that it wasn't a sudden snap. So there has to be a lack of planning and premeditation. Now, it no longer has to be as sudden as it did in the law of provocation, and this allows for sort of slow burn cases. But remember, the longer the delay between the provocation from the victim and the actual killing, the longer that delay goes on, the weaker your defence becomes, because the idea is that you lost your self-control, you were unable to control yourself, and you killed. Of course, if you regain self-control, you're expected to stop yourself from murdering. So the longer that gap, the more likely the jury is to think, well, that person's probably calmed down since, and now it's revenge rather than loss of control. Now for the really key part, that is often the weakest part in a candidate answer. The law of loss of control in the Coroners and Justice Act 2009 narrowed down the circumstances where a person can argue they lost control. Now, a number of things might trigger you to lose control. Confession, it's when people stand too close to me on the metro platform. And that's, of course, even more important in times of pandemics. But that wouldn't qualify. So things may trigger you, things may make you angry, things may make you snap. But that trigger has to be one of the two that is recognised in the law. And it is now clear that sexual infidelity alone is not a qualifying trigger. So finding out that your partner has been cheating or catching them in the act is likely to trigger people. It is likely to make them lose their control, see red. But it's not enough to be a qualifying trigger, and that is the key word. A qualifying trigger is one of the two that's recognised in the Act. So what is? First is a fear of serious violence to themselves or another person from the victim, almost like self-defence. I was scared that person was going to seriously hurt me, so I lost my control and I killed. I've underlined the word serious. It's not enough for there to just be a fear of violence, and that's what candidates tend to write when they're in a rush in the exam. It must be fear of serious violence. So if I threaten to punch you and then you apparently lose control and stab me to death, that would not be acceptable as a qualifying trigger. That wouldn't be enough to show you feared serious violence. In Ward, however, if you remember in that case, the victim headbutted the defendant's brother. The defendant clearly feared serious violence from that person because they were headbutting his brother. So that made him snap, lose control, and kill. That was seen as a qualifying trigger. Or the alternative is looking at what the victim said or did. And maybe it wasn't a serious threat. Maybe it was a lesser threat, or maybe it was mocking. Things said or done, so it can be actions as well as words, that are considered to be extremely grave, which is serious, that left the defendant feeling seriously wronged, and that was justifiable. Now, in the case of Hatter, he clearly felt seriously wronged by his girlfriend seeing another man, but that was not justified in light of the circumstances. And also, you know, seeing someone else is hurtful, but it's not considered to be extremely grave. Now, the case of Clinton is an unusual case because, of course, it did involve sexual infidelity. But remember that sexual infidelity was part of a parcel of things that his wife said and did. So it wasn't just the cheating, it was also the mocking of his consideration of suicide and threatening to take away his children. It wasn't just the cheating, it was the comparison of his sexual prowess to her new lovers, etc. It was the whole package of things. They were considered to be very serious in the circumstances. He obviously felt seriously wrong and upset, and that was justifiable. A lot of people would understand and empathise with him. So what we've done there is we've explained the two qualifying triggers. Now for the AO2. All right, so you need to go through both triggers in the exam. You will still get credit for clearly saying one of them doesn't apply, just as much as you will say they do. So check that first qualifying trigger. Remember, the defendant must have feared serious violence from the victim to themselves or another person. So what are we looking for now in a scenario? Obviously, we're looking for some sort of threat or attack from the victim, from the person who was killed. Was it to the defendant themselves, or remember, it can be to someone else. So in Ward, it was to his brother. It could be to a person's child, for example, or partner, or something like that. It doesn't just have to be directed at them. Make sure it's serious. So as I said before, if the victim just said that they were going to punch them or they were kind of grabbing them, that would not be enough to be a serious threat. So if they're threatening to kill or they're aiming a gun at someone, something like that, that probably would be justified. However, remember, the case of Dawes tells us that if the defendant starts the fight, they can't use that as an excuse. They can't say that I feared serious violence from the victim if the reason the victim was doing that is because they'd attacked them or threatened them first. Now, it could be that you have that threat of serious violence in the scenario, and that would be enough, but still check the second one. Remember, it could be both triggers or just one, so always check them both. So the next thing, did the victim say or do anything? What did they do? Point out the obvious to the examiner. What bits do you think were triggering the defendant? So for example, it could be a less serious threat. It could be a minor threat, I'm going to punch you. Or it could be mocking. And it could be sort of inappropriate advances. There's lots of things that could potentially fall under that umbrella. But remember, in cases like Hatter, it wasn't just cheating alone. Cases like Zebedee, it wasn't his father's incontinence. It has to be something that they said or did that was grave and serious. So again, if it was a less serious threat on its own, it still would fail. However, it might work as a package of other things. So again, looking out for things like mocking. It has to be serious though in the circumstances. Now this one's usually quite easy to spot. Did the defendant feel seriously wronged? Generally yes, because they maybe were angry or upset and they lost control. So this one's usually quite easy. Was the defendant seriously offended? Probably if they lost control and killed. However, you've then got to check that that was justifiable. It's not enough that they had a serious sense of being wronged. It has to be justified. And by that we mean understandable. So I suppose put yourself in their shoes. Would you have felt really, really offended if that had happened to you as well? So if you found out that, you know, the person you were seeing was seeing someone else, would you feel seriously wronged, like really, really offended and angry and upset? You would be upset, sure, you would be angry, but the law has said that's not quite enough. Whereas if you think back to the case of Clinton, where he found out that his wife was cheating with multiple men, she'd mocked him and said that they were much better lovers than he was. He said that he'd been considering suicide, and she basically laughed in his face and said that he would never ever try something like that. You know, that was a bit you have to have more courage to try that, which is of course silly. When you put all of those things together, you start understanding where he's coming from and thinking, yeah, I can understand why he would feel really, really wronged by that. It has to meet one at least of those, otherwise it fails. So if someone is threatening them and that clearly triggered them, that's not enough. It has to be a threat of serious violence. Or if they found out that their partner was cheating or seeing someone else, that may have triggered them and left them feeling really wronged, but it wouldn't be enough because it's not serious, and the rest of us probably wouldn't agree with that. That's reinforced by the final part of loss of control, which again students tend to miss out as they run out of time and steam. Just the reasonable man test. So it's asking, would a reasonable person of the same sex and age have reacted similarly in the same circumstances? So remember, we don't take into account if the person's intoxicated. So we're not looking at whether other drunk people would have overreacted as well. And it's not about a person's temperament. So if that person is known for being particularly hot-headed, that doesn't give them a free pass to be losing their temper and losing their control all the time. So if you do have a really, really bad temper, you will be compared to someone with a normal, reasonable amount of restraint and tolerance. Once you've explained that, then check it. Just, do you think other people would have reacted similarly? So would they have lost control? It's not necessarily about like, would they have murdered them in exactly the same way, but would they have lost control at that trigger? Do you think other people would do it? And remember, consider their age. So if they're a young person, perhaps they may be more likely to react to a trigger. Look at gender. So genders are typically seen as reacting in different ways. So men are more likely to react very quickly. Women are more likely to have a slow burn. Also, look at their circumstances. So being drunk is not circumstances. Having a temper is not circumstances. We are talking things like, for example, do they have like medical conditions, which is where the overlap comes in. So does this person maybe have a history of mental illness, which helps us explain why they've reacted in a certain way. So for example, someone mocking something may not trigger normally, but if a person, for example, has suffered in the past from bullying or things like that, in Zebedee, for example, his elderly father, who he was looking after, he'd been sexually abused by when he was a child. So in those circumstances, would you understand his anger towards his father in that same way? So that's what we're talking about with circumstances, their background and experiences, not their like individual characteristics or the fact that they're drunk or on drugs. So what conclusions can we come to here at the end of a loss of control scenario? So clearly, if it is down to alcohol alone, that is not a qualifying trigger. So being drunk and I lost control, I blacked out because I'd had so much vodka, is not going to be loss of control. If it's due to a recognised medical condition, so something internal, then you need to check diminished responsibility instead. It's not going to be loss of control. If you think that, this person is reacting because they have PTSD, that needs to be diminished responsibility instead. So even if you think there was a trigger, if you think at the end of the day it wasn't really the trigger that did it, it was because the person has PTSD, then it's more likely to be diminished responsibility, or both. And then if it's due to at least one of the qualifying triggers, if all of the other elements are satisfied, so they definitely fully lost control and others would react similarly, then they can use the defense. So remember, it has to be a qualifying trigger. So if it's a trigger, that's not enough. It has to be at least one of those two things. So hopefully that makes sense. To find out more about the AO1, I've done other summary videos, so you can watch that for a bit more of an in-depth explanation of the explanations of law. But otherwise, thanks for watching.